Hello, it's your friendly neighborhood law professor, Leah Litman of Strict Scrutiny, here to explain what the F is going on with the Federal Reserve Board. So, Donald Trump announced on Truth Social that he was trying to fire Lisa Cook, who is a governor of the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve Board, of course, is the independent agency that, manages the United States economy, in part by setting interest rates. So, jeopardizing the independence of the Fed, that is, subjecting the institution to political control and political whims, is kind of catastrophic for the United States economy. I'm going to explain more of the law governing the Fed and other independent agencies and how Trump's attempt to fire Cook might play out, and then draw some through lines between what Trump is trying to do with the Fed and what he's done in other contexts. But I did just want to briefly start with, the whole economy thing. So the Fed is what we call independent. Here, that means its governors, the leaders, can't be fired by the president at will. That is simply because the president disagrees with their policy decisions, like interest rates or regulating how much money banks have to keep in store in order to make sure they're solvent and don't fail. And the reason why the Fed is independent is because we want the economy to be run based on considerations like long-term stability, not based on what might be convenient in the next year or during an election cycle, but cause a Great Depression or a Great Recession later on. The Federal Reserve Board tries to manage inflation and employment, and these are goals that require long-term expert planning, not off-the-cuff political whims of what might be convenient. And the prospect that the president might control the Fed is disastrous. The way I think about it is, do you want the economy to be run by a guy who bankrupted several businesses? That's a no from me. And do want to step back and just underscore that, some of the costs to what Donald Trump is trying to do with the Fed, they are costs to everyone. And they are costs of the racism of this administration targeting Black people in power. Lisa Cook is the first Black woman to serve as a governor on the Fed, and Trump trying to fire her and crash the economy because, I don't know, it's too woke. Not great. Apparently, the new DEI is down the economy in an incinerator. Okay, so that's the kind of economics of this. As I said, I'm a law professor, so I want to focus more on the law. The Fed is what's called independent. And again, that means the president can't fire the leaders of the Fed because they won't pursue his preferred policies, like lowering interest rates. Under the statutes, the laws Congress has passed, presidents can remove the heads of independent agencies for what's called cause. So we don't know exactly what cause means because no presidents have really litigated it. But in theory, hypothetically, cause is supposed to mean things like, I don't know, you've been convicted of some felonies, or, you're just not showing up to work for weeks or months. In those circumstances, it's okay for the president to fire you. Now, the president has purported to fire Cook on the basis of some allegations / maybe investigation by Bill Pulte, the head of the Federal Housing Finance Authority. And Pulte alleges, it's still unproven, that Cook engaged in mortgage fraud in securing loans, the loan terms for a house, actually one here in Ann Arbor and an apartment in Atlanta. And Pulte supposedly referred this matter to the Department of Justice for potential criminal prosecution. Now, the Federal Reserve Board has been around for more than 100 years, and it has had more than 100 members. No president has ever fired a member of the Federal Reserve Board, a governor, before. No president has claimed to have fired one before. And this is not one of those situations where it's good to be first, more like first is the worst. Okay, so now presidents, particularly this president, have claimed the authority to fire the heads of other agencies that are supposed to be independent. That is, Donald Trump has said he can fire heads of agencies he doesn't agree with, even though Congress has prohibited him from doing so and limited limited him to firing those officials for cause. And the argument that Trump and his administration are making is that the United States Constitution requires the president to have the authority to control by removing the heads of departments, even those agencies that are created by Congress, such that Constitution wins out over statutes passed by Congress, and Congress can't actually protect the heads of these agencies from presidential removal. Okay, so this idea is sometimes described as the unitary executive theory. This theory, the unitary executive, was really first trotted out in the 1980s by the Reagan administration. They created this theory, as part of their attempt to provide a justification for why the president had the authority to fire people, within the federal government. And as a lawyer in the Reagan administration, John G. Roberts Jr., our current Chief Justice, actually argued that all independent agencies are unconstitutional, relying on this unitary executive theory. So the right-wing legal movement insists that the unitary executive theory is the law and that it's super awesome for presidents to be able to fire agencies because who needs independence and expertise? Even though, this whole unitary executive king thing is kind of plunging us into chaos and a possible economic catastrophe right now. But the unitary executive people hate this nearly century-old decision of the United States Supreme Court, Humphrey's Executor. That decision, decided in the 1930s, had said it was constitutional for Congress to tell the president cannot fire willy-nilly the heads of independent agencies that Congress has chosen to insulate, to protect from removal by the president. So that case, Humphrey's Executor, upheld Congress's ability to insulate members of the Federal Trade Commission from removal by the president. But guess what? The Trump administration indicated it is going to ask the Supreme Court to overrule Humphrey's Executor. Note that overruling Humphrey's Executor was also one of the things that Project 2025 encouraged in their plans for an elected dictatorship of right-wing reactionaries, and rich people. And because, Trump and the Trump administration is hot to trot on getting rid of independent agencies, Trump fired or purported to fire the heads of several agencies that are supposed to be independent under the law, like the NLRB or the National Labor Relations Board, the MSPB, the Merit System Protection Board, the agencies that administers, the Federal Civil Service, as well as the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the agency that basically ensures, toys or bedroom products don't kill your kids. So the Supreme Court, in their infinite wisdom, let Donald Trump fire the heads of these agencies that are supposed to be independent from presidential removal. In what was a pretty stunning order from the Supreme Court last May, in a case called Trump versus Wilcox, the Supreme Court said Trump could go ahead and fire the heads of the NLRB and MSPB, and they later said he could fire the head of the CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, as well. They didn't, that is the court, the Republican justices, did not even bother to mention Humphrey's Executor, the nearly century-old case that said it is okay, it is constitutional for Congress to prohibit presidents from firing the heads of these independent agencies. The Republican justices just did their little unitary executive dance and said presidents have all the executive power and therefore have to be able to remove anyone exercising the executive power, including the heads of agencies that Congress has created and tried to make independent. But, here's the big but, the Republican justices added, except for the Fed. The court created what Justice Elena Kagan said in dissent for the other Democratic appointees. They called it a bespoke Fed exception. So what the Republican justices said is the president has power to fire basically everybody who heads independent agencies except the heads of the Federal Reserve Board. And they included this sentence that said, quote, "The Federal Reserve is a uniquely structured quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks of the United States." That's like a string of words. It's word salad hand waving, basically made up bullshit. Basically, the Republican justices think Congress has good reason to insulate the Federal Reserve Board from presidential influence and removal, even though the Republican justices don't think Congress has good enough reason to insulate the heads of other agencies from presidential removal. It is basically an attempt to have their cake and eat it too. Like, the Republican justices want to advance the right-wing legal movement's expansion of presidential power and ability to prevent agencies from engaging in public interested regulation, that restricts corporate power and corporate interests. But, and here's the big but, they don't want the president to crash the economy. The fact that Donald Trump is trying to bulldoze through the incoherent exception that Roberts and his Republican colleagues created is, as ever, a reminder that you cannot give Donald Trump something and ask for something in return. No deals. Like, the Republican justices basically begged Trump, just don't fire the Fed, even though we're cool with you firing like everybody else. Leave the Fed. We'll let you violate basically every other law restricting your power to fire people. And Donald Trump said, watch this. Okay, so Lisa Cook is going to fight, right? She said the president purported to fire her. She's not going to resign. She says she's going to continue to carry out her duties. So how might this play out? In most cases of presidential removal, there's a conflict, or the conflict is supposed to be between a statute, the law Congress passes, and supposedly the Constitution. That is, presidents will say, I'm firing this person because I think I can, even though Congress has said I can't do so in these circumstances. And then the Supreme Court will decide whether the statutes trying to limit the president's power to remove are constitutional. That's not what Donald Trump did here. Trump says he's firing Cook for cause. He says he is complying with the statute, not violating it, because the Constitution gives him that authority. So the fight he's teeing up is, does he actually have cause for firing Cook? Is this firing consistent with federal law? And will the Supreme Court or federal courts review his determination that there's cause? There are reasons to think that Donald Trump isn't actually in compliance with the law and that he doesn't have cause for firing Cook. For one thing, some older Supreme Court cases suggest that where an official can only be fired for cause, they have to receive notice and a hearing, right? Trump's Truth Social post is not that. This should also be understood, right, in light of Trump's tendency and his administration's tendency to, for lack of a better word, trump up legal charges, to go after political rivals. I mean, think back to, the initial arrest and detention of Mayor Ras Baraka, as they were attempting to inspect and protest a new ICE facility, the charging of Representative Monica MacGyver for exercising oversight functions of ICE, charging a state judge in Wisconsin because the judge did not do what the administration wanted her to do with respect to treating non-citizens in the court. They have charged Kelmar Abrego Garcia, the man wrongfully expelled to El Salvador. They have failed to get indictments in cases against people protesting ICE enforcement and of people who they allege assaulted ICE officers because they are, again, really maximally, expansively abusing federal criminal authority, to go after political rivals. In general, Donald Trump loves to create pretexts. That is, like, when a statute or law says presidents can do this thing, but only if there's an emergency, he will just go ahead and create the emergency or pretend there is an emergency. This is kind of the situation with tariffs, where he says there is like a crisis, in, I don't know, like the fentanyl trade or, trade deficits, and therefore I get to impose these tariffs. Or when he insists there's a crisis of disorder in Los Angeles, and therefore I get to, federalize the National Guard. Or when he insists, there's this like crisis and predatory incursion of Tren de Aragua in the United States, and therefore I get to expel people to El Salvador. Like, he creates the basis for the emergency. And it's all, for lack of a better word, bullshit pretext. So what is going to happen in the case of the Federal Reserve Board and Lisa Cook. I mean, on one hand, the Supreme Court, like they are a bunch of cowards who love to give Republican presidents what they want. They allowed Donald Trump to dismantle the Department of Education, even though they said President Joe Biden's Department of Education could not forgive student loans. On the other hand, the Republican appointees probably like their stock portfolios and their friends at the Chamber of Commerce. So in the course of this likely litigation over whether Donald Trump has fired Lisa Cook, there will be a question about whether the federal courts can review the president's determination that there is cause for firing Cook. Under some statutes, the president's determination is conclusive and can't be second guessed by courts. That is a possibility for what the Supreme Court might say here. Another possibility is that they would say, well, courts can review whether there's cause, but we're going to give substantial deference, right, a thumb on the scale in favor of the president's determination. So even if we disagree with it, that's not enough for us to say there isn't cause. That's another possibility. And, the Supreme Court has said there is this exception to the president's constitutional authority to remove officers when it comes to the Federal Reserve Board. But the reality is the Republican justices in Roberts Court have gone back on their word before. In previous cases about president's power to remove, they've said, oh, we're not overruling Humphrey's executor, this 1930s case that allowed Congress to create independent agencies. But then, whoops, last spring, they effectively overruled it by giving Trump the authority to fire the heads of multi-member commissions. And they've done this, in other contexts as well, saying, oh, it's going to be okay. We're not going to do this other thing. And then they go ahead and do it, like with the Voting Rights Act, but I won't go down that rabbit hole now. So we will be watching to see how this plays out. And again, that's just a super quick law explainer on what is going on with the Federal Reserve Board.